Well, I am talking about the Shimotsuki family today, and their crest is to be true, they're two katanas crossing, and I don't have any katanas, so we have a cutlass and a short sword. At least I think that's what this is. I'm not sure. I don't know. It's from Halloween, Spirit Halloween, or Goodwill, or whatever. I just don't want them to fall down and make a noise during the video. Stay. Stay. You're good. You're perfect, Brenda. You stay on the bed. You're a good girl. You sure. Okay. So this is kind of a overview-ish / specifically talking about two members mainly of the Shimotsuki family in regards to Wano. I will have two separate videos where I discuss Shimotsuki Yasuie, where I talk about his life. Those will be the next two. And then I will have a separate one where I talk about the other daimyo of Wano that were part of Yamato's flashback and such. So this video is the Shimotsuki family, which is, of course, one of the most renowned and powerful families inside of Wano, and to a degree known a bit outside of Wano in the case of Shimotsuki Village and Kozaburo Shimotsuki and, the Watawichi Monji and Enma and all this other stuff. And, of course, the same lineage leads to Kuina and Zoro and possibly to Shigi, depending on whatever the heck else happened in that with the other members that left Wano. So a bit overall, we have, of course, their family crests are, two swords crossed, or two cutlasses. I guess they are cutlasses in the image, I guess, crossed. And they have been both the daimyos of the Hakumai region in the form of Yasuie and possibly his father, depending on stuff, and the Ringo region more notably, since that is where Ryuma is from and where his grave is. It's not where his corpse is. His corpse was there for a long time, stolen, turned into a zombie, and then set ablaze with blue fire when beaten by Zoro. That'll be discussed a little bit later in the video. Yeah. So in that regard, they're very well known within Wano. Not necessarily as much over the last, beyond like Ryuma necessarily over the last 20 years in Wano, simply because of the fact of Orochi kind of like squashing as much of that knowledge as possible, so it's not passed down as easily. But I'm sure the children of Wano will definitely be learning about Yasuie and his sacrifice, and of course more in regards to the other daimyo who stood up to Kaido and everything, who I will talk about a little bit later in this, in regards to that. Some of the important members I did want to go over, two mostly, Shimotsuki Ryuma, excuse me, not Ryumu, that's a different name, I don't know what the heck that name was, Ryuma, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail with his life simply because beyond a little bit of like what we see in Monsters, we don't know that much else, and to be honest, I haven't watched Monsters. Nothing against it. I tried it and I'm like, no, I can't do this. I tried. It didn't work. But in regards to Shimotsuki Ryuma, he is kind of the one who seems to be like the possible origin point of the Shimotsuki family. He was, of course, this world-famous samurai whose legends of his actions traveled outside of Wano, depending on whether or not he actually traveled outside of Wano is a bit left up for debate. But he lived in Wano during the time when it was called the Country of Gold, centuries ago. I don't think we've ever gotten an exact timeline for when Ryuma lines up. I think there was like something about like 400 years ago where he was possibly a contemporary with Noland, for when, the Skypiea flashback and everything. So there's like a possible connection there. I know a lot of people think that Ryuma was on Joy Boy's crew, during the Void Century and everything, which I guess is a possibility, but I thought we had confirmation that Ryuma was like 400 years ago at some point in time. I thought that was mentioned at some point in time by either Moria or by Ryuma's zombie at some point in time. I could have been wrong, but I don't remember exactly. But many, many centuries ago is when he lived, and he is, of course, referred to as the legendary samurai, the sword god, the god of the blade, whatever other variation you want to go with. And he is a direct ancestor to Zoro. And, of course, Zoro and Shimotsuki Ushimaru, who is the other one I will be addressing in this video, they are, of course, direct descendants of Ryuma. By a technicality, there's always the possibility that, Yasuie is also a direct descendant of Ryuma, but since we don't know where all of the, family trees break off and everything else like that for him, and Kozaburo and, all of those lines and lineages and everything for where those break off and everything, we're not exactly sure yet. And I'll address this. Oda did draw Zoro's family tree in regards to his parents and his grandparents, and his great uncle in the form of Ushimaru, but we don't know that much else about beyond that. Like, how many generations ago was Ryuma? Not that that's necessarily required to know, but wherever the other, and then and as I said, like, we know that Kuina and Kozaburo and Koshiro's, their lineage is tied in with the Shimotsuki clan as well, possibly Tashigi's as well, just given how much she looks like Kuina and everything. And then, of course, there is also the connection that Yasuie himself, and by an extension Toko, would have to the Shimotsuki clan as well. So there's, like, questions there. Some of the things we do know about Ryuma, obviously, are he was 47 years old when he died. He died in Wano. That is basically confirmed given the fact that that's where his grave was. And, of course, his legendary sword, Shusui, is, of course, was part of his grave marker and everything. And, of course, he, was this amazing hero throughout Wano and everything. In regards to the bit of history that we know that he was born in Wano. He grew up there, probably in the Ringo region, became an amazing sword master, has Shusui as his sword for so long, and eventually he kills a dragon, which is freaking badass. No argument here on that one. He kills a freaking dragon. And there's everything that happens in Monsters, which, as I said, I haven't seen it, but I know, like, the summary of it and everything. But I'm just like, I get that it's an adaptation of a prior work that Oda did, which is perfectly fine. But the fact that they connect it in with Zoro, because, I don't have a problem with them having, like, Zoro's voice actor voice Ryuma. That's fine. That's fine. But, like, they had, like, where they have it tied in at the end, where it's like, this doesn't line up quite right with One Piece, and the fact that Monsters clearly does not take place in Wano, because Ryuma is the only person dressed like he's in Wano, and talking like he's in Wano, and this is not the right landscape nor design for Wano. So there's always the possibility that Monsters takes place outside of Wano, and that Ryuma grew up in Wano, and then he left Wano at some point in time, traveled the world, ended up in this, like, Western-ish style town, and interacted with Flare. I like Flare. I wouldn't have a problem if, like, Flare was also somehow an ancestor of Zoro through, like her and Ryuma got married or something, but I don't think that's the case. But I like Flare. She's cute. And then they have the other two characters, like with the dragon horn and everything else like that, and then, of course, it does eventually lead up to the climax where Ryuma does, he kills the dragon, like, in a single strike or so, which is cool, and that's where he earns the title the Sword God and everything. And so there's a lot of stuff there that happens in Monsters that, like, it doesn't line up right with One Piece. Not that, like, this type of a town can't exist in One Piece, because it can, given how, anachronistic One Piece is. But the thing is that Wano itself is not that anachronistic in regards to what we see throughout the course of Wano. It seems fairly uniform in the fact that they have been isolated from the world for 800 years, implies that they're not going to have a whole lot of anachronisms there. Yes, there's, bits and pieces that possibly find their way in from people who end up there, but not nearly as much, stuff. And like a lot of the innovation came more recently because of Kaido and his crew coming in and everything. A lot of that was like innovated a lot there in regards to the weapons factories and, the different things like that. So there's all of that. And, so Ryuma has this amazing adventure where he, kills a dragon, which is just awesome. And then eventually, later in his life, he either ends up back in Wano or he never left Wano, and somehow the story of him killing this dragon was such an amazing story that in the centuries since his death, people who left Wano, because we know there have been various people who have left Wano, found their way outside of Wano, and they brought this story of Ryuma with him and passed it down through, they told it to people, possibly other members of the Shimotsuki clan made their way outside of Wano, and they proclaimed, the amazing feat that Ryuma did. Now, there is also the thought that the dragon that Ryuma killed may have been a dragon that belonged to a celestial dragon, or it may have been taking it as in he killed a celestial dragon. Some celestial dragon decided to try to go to Wano and take Wano because gold, there's gold there. Because they're stupid. And ended up there, and then Ryuma just killed them. Killed their dragon, and possibly them in the process, and that story spread. But we don't know exactly the whole context for that. We just know he killed a dragon, and somehow that story, for as amazing as it is, ended up outside of Wano. Which I'm fine with. And eventually, later in his life, he ended up, he had children, grandchildren, he got married, all of that stuff. And eventually, he ended up getting sick because of some unspecified disease that killed him when he was 47 years old. Because we can't have nice things. Now, can we, Oda? Now, there is always a thought that it was some type of a cancer or something like that is another way of, explaining that away for, what happened. Because, there are people who die that young because of cancer and, stuff like that. From there, we have, post-mortem in regards to what happens with Ryuma's body. We know about 21 years ago, or 21 years ago or so, to be start of the main story, so 23 years ago, Gecko Moria ended up in Wano. He was there to fight Kaido. Got his butt kicked, he got his whole crew dead, and still managed to capture and steal the corpse of Ryuma along with Shusui. Much to the whole country's devastation. And then 3 years after that is when everything happens with Odin. So there's a lot of stuff that happens there. So eventually what happens is, of course, Moria then has Ryuma's body, and he holds on to it for a good chunk of time. I mean, they have the giant freezer thing that they have in that they had on Thriller Bark, and that's probably where they kept Ryuma. We know that his body would have been in the Ringo region in the northern cemetery and everything, in the freezing climate and everything, which is why his corpse was preserved so well. Very much like Utsi, the Ice Age man that was found in the Alps or whatever so many decades ago or whatever, and how much information we've learned from him. But since his corpse was so well preserved, that's why we know so much about him. Ryuma is a very similar case. Bodies that are found in those types of situations where it's been too cold for any type of bacteria or bugs or anything like that to grow or to find the body, preserves them. And Ringo is god-awfully cold and icy and not a good place to live at all, but people do. Because they're tough. Then again, I look at the same thing when it comes to Greenland and other places like that, where I'm just why would you want to live in a place where there is sun only 3 months out of the year for not long? But then again, I would still like to go there and see it. So I'm one to argue with there. Eventually, of course, what ends up happening is about 5 years before the start of the story, so 7 years ago, is when Ryuma manages, or when Moria manages to finally reanimate Ryuma's body by stealing Brooks' shadow, and then with his Kage no Mi powers, and then putting it into Ryuma and making him a zombie, and making him one of the zombie generals. So then we have all of that. And then, of course, then, at some point in time, Brook did try to fight Ryuma to try to get his shadow back. One of the other times he landed on Thriller Bark, and that didn't work. And then eventually it ends up being that, of course, when the Straw Hats arrive there, and then, of course, Zoro is the one who does end up fighting against Ryuma and manages to defeat him, and he's defeated by his own descendant, unbeknownst to either of them at the time. Zoro manages to defeat him, and via his body ends up burning to ashes and, disintegrating. He, before that, Ryuma, bequeaths Shunsui to Zoro. And then Zoro keeps Shunsui, and then, of course, he has to learn how to fight with it, because it's a bit of a different type of sword than he's had. The fact that it is a black blade, and it's, heavier than it should be because of, the amount of hockey that was put into it. I know that there's lots of contention when it comes to, if Ryuma was the one who did finally make it a black blade, how were there not other black blades around besides it and Yoru, which is always a big question. And then, of course, there's, how did Shunsui become so famous outside of Wano, even though it was Ryuma's sword, and it's been hidden there for centuries and everything, yet, Toshigi knows all about it and stuff. And then there's the whole question of, well, maybe Ryuma was the one who didn't make it into a black blade, but maybe someone had it prior to him and gave it to him, and they had put a lot of time and effort and energy into the blade, and then Ryuma, during his life, managed to finally cement that as a black blade. That's a possibility. In regards to Ryuma's legacy, obviously, there is, of course, the fight against the dragon became legend and was passed down through many, many generations. Is still told today in Wano and in other places around the world, in the One Piece world and everything, by technicality in our world as well, and is, known throughout the world. He is known as this, legendary, amazing samurai and everything. And Shunsui itself is considered one of the treasures of Wano. It is declared a national treasure because of what it represents to the citizens of Wano. And, of course, during this whole time frame, it was, lots of stuff happened to it. Eventually, Zoro has his hands on it, and he's, had it for the 2 years. And then up until they get to Wano. And then, of course, reasons get stolen by a shape-shifting kitsune type thing, fox, as a it gets stolen by that as a bridge guardian and has to deal with all of that, and eventually via Hiyori, placating Zoro and being like, if you allow Shunsui to be returned, I will give you my father's sword. I will give you a sword that belonged to Kozuki Oden. And Zoro agrees. And, of course, Ryuma is, of course, referred to as the greatest hero of Wano country, the greatest hero in all of Wano and everything because of his deeds. And eventually it is reasons, stuff. Eventually, basically, what ends up happening is, of course, the sword is returned, and we do kind of get, this bit of a carried on legacy in regards to Zoro because, he kind of is this new embodiment of Ryuma and everything, and, he wanted to defeat Kaido and everything. And the, by the end of Wano, after the Battle of Onigashima and everything, there's all of the stories about Luffy's defeat of Kaido, and they are comparing him in hero status, this Joy Boy, as rivaling Ryuma in his status, which is kind of fun. So there's that. Now let's talk about a slightly more recent person in the timeline. We are going to discuss Shimotsuki Ushimaru, who was the former daimyo of the Ringo region, and he, of course, also was the great uncle of Zoro, via Zoro's grandmother, Furiko. As I mentioned, stuff drawn out in Family Tree for Zoro and an SBS. I don't think I've mentioned this in a different video, or at least I've mentioned that to my mother, I think, because I thank my mom for the fact that she lets me just sit and ramble to her about One Piece, and I appreciate that she, remembers as much as possible, which is very appreciated. I know that there's stuff in the works for the One Piece remake and everything that they're going to be doing. And it'll be interesting to see if they try to bring in stuff from the SBSs and stuff like that for like how they work that into things in the story. Things that we've learned about the characters since then to like foreshadow stuff and things like that. Stuff where they might show something in regards to, Zoro's family or something like that. Might get some bits here and there about that, but we'll see what happens with that. In regards to Ushimaru, he was the younger brother of Furiko, and he, of course, became the daimyo of the Ringo region, and this was 20 years ago, and he did try to stand up to Orochi, which I'll get to in a moment. At death, he was 50 years old, and that was 20 years ago, so he was born 70 years ago. So I was trying to think if there was like a character to compare him to, and I'm like, he's like 2 years older than Big Mom. He would have been like 2 years, born 2 years prior to Big Mom or so. It was like the closest one I can think of at the moment, but there are others, I'm sure. So then we get into his history, of Ushimaru's history. So born in the Ringo region, probably was born into the Shimotsuki clan, is a direct descendant of Ryuma, and he ended up becoming the daimyo of the Ringo region at some point in time. We know that 55 years ago, so when he would have been like 15, is when his sister, Furiko, along with Shimotsuki Kosaboro, and, was it like 50 others or something like that, 20 others, whatever it was, that a bunch of them left Wano. And there is always the question of, like, why did she leave Wano if she was the member of, like, a daimyo house and everything like that, for why his sister would have left, for why Furiko would have left. That is a bit left up for debate as to why that would be the case, but we don't know the exact answer to that. But eventually, there's always so many different answers for what it was. She didn't want, there was an arranged marriage she didn't want to be in. She was far more adventurous than her brother, and she decided to leave. She was in love with someone else and wanted to go and leave with them, which doesn't really quite pan out because she ends up marrying someone else anyway, who's not even from Wano, and all of that stuff. So, and of course, we don't know their age differences for like how much older she was than him, but she left Wano. And he was probably very sad about that, but he was probably like, go and have your journey and, everything else like that. And we don't know that much else about him. We know that eventually he ends up with a... I cannot remember... I don't think I can pronounce the name of what Onimaru is, a comedy... the fox thing that Unimaru is. And he has, he is Ushimaru's companion for a long time. We know that 39 years ago, he was, he read the newspaper that goes around Wano, and he reads about Odin, taking over Curry and then eventually becoming, the daimyo of Curry. And then we really don't hear anything else about him until 28 years ago, when the daimyo all took part in a meeting in regards to the health of Shimotsuki, or of Kozuki Sukiyake. And we know that he was there along with all of the other daimyos, including Yasuie, and the other daimyos who would have been the two that I'll talk about in the other daimyos video, the ones that were from the Amasuki family and the not the Yamasuki family, the other two families whose names I cannot remember at the moment, and I'm sorry. But he was at that meeting where the fake Sukiyaki convinced the daimyo that, Orochi would be the temporary shogun. Bad idea. And then we get to 8 years later, after Odin is executed and everything, that so Fugetsu and Uzuki are the other two daimyo families. Sorry, I could not remember their names off the top of my head. I'm sorry. But what ends up happening is, of course, after Odin is killed, that sparks this moment where the other 4 remaining daimyo decide that they are going to try to stand up. 3 of them do. Yasuie is not part of this group, and I'll discuss that in the next 2 videos about Yasuie. But we know what happens is Ushimaru leads, along with all of his samurai, and the samurai and the forces of Fugetsu, Omusubi, mispronounce these names, I'm sorry, and Uzuki Tempura. He led all 3 of them led their forces in a rebellion where they attacked Onigashima. And they probably caused a bit of damage to Kaido's army because, as I stated, I think it was in the Odin video, at this point in time, Kaido wouldn't have had all of his main forces. He wouldn't have the Tobi-Roppo. He would really only have himself, king and queen, which is already a force to be reckoned with anyway, plus all of just like his foot soldiers. And I guess whatever the predecessors to the Tobi-Roppo were, because Jack was like 8, so that wouldn't have made any difference, and the rest of the Tobi-Roppo weren't there yet, or they were children, or not born yet, when all of that happened. And what ends up happening is, of course, the 3 daimyo try to fight against Kaido and his forces. Unfortunately, this results in them being imprisoned inside of this cave. And what ends up happening is, of course, while they're there, they end up getting locked in with Yamato because Kaido shows up, and after Yamato's had like his, starting to rebel phase, he throws him in there and like with just like a piece of, so it's like a bit of food. His intention is to try to force Yamato to realize that, like, because you're my son, these guys are just going to go up against you and they're just going to cause you problems and everything like that. They're not going to have any sympathy for you. He's just trying to scare Yamato. Although, there is the question of, like, if Kaido would have actually been okay if Yamato was killed in that regard, given the fact that we know later on Yamato has the cuffs that stay on him for, like, 20 years. So that's up for debate. But what ends up happening is, of course, Yamato gets locked in there with them, and all 3 of the daimyo are very easily able to, like, break out of their chains, and they break Yamato's chains, or at least they break the actual chains, not the shackles, or not the cuffs, and they give Yamato the food, because Yamato is a child, and they are grown men, and they will give the food to the child. And, what ends up happening is, of course, well, in there, Yamato's like, but I'm Kaido's child. Why aren't you just trying to kill me? Like, you're a child. And clearly your father doesn't care about you. He threw you in here with us after we just tried to kill him. So all of that stuff is what happens. And during this whole time that they are in the cave, Yamato reveals that he has Odin's journal, and all of them end up, Yamato can't really read the journal very well, so they all start helping Yamato with trying to read the journal and everything, and probably help with teaching Yamato to read at that point in time, because Yamato's like 8 when all of that happens anyway, so they're helping Yamato, and of course, then those 3 are all learning about what happened on Odin's journey and everything, and what happened at Laugh Tale and whatever else is like left out from, Odin's flashback and everything. They're learning about all of this stuff. And the part that Momonosuke is to play in the future and everything else like that. So they're all reading this, and they're like, we gotta get this kid out of here. And at some point in time, Yamato asks them, like, what their names are, and Ushimaru just says, nobody important, is what his name is. And I don't think the other two actually ever give their names to Yamato, so it's a little bit left up for debate for whether or not Yamato knows who is actually in the cave with him. And so we get some of that. And then eventually what ends up happening is after 10 days, where they're all hungry and everything, what ends up happening is they tell Yamato that they are going to, that at this rate they may not, be able to battle Kaido again anyway. And of course, with the predicted prophecy and everything else like that from Toki in 20 years, they're definitely not going to be in shape to be able to fight then. Because, at the very least, Ushimaru himself would be in his 70s, would be 70 years old by then. And I don't remember if we get ages on the other two, or we probably do, I just don't remember what they are off the top of my head. That'll be in the other Daimyo video. But what ends up happening is they're like, okay, but we're going to get you out of here. And, and they tell Yamato, and like Yamato says that he will fight for Wano on that day. And the samurai are like, we're going to get you out of here. And what they do is, of course, they very easily break out of the cave, which they could have done very easily anyway in the beginning, but they were like waiting or whatever. So they cut their way out of the cave with like a couple of great strikes of their swords. They break their way out of the cave. They go to fight Kaido in order to give Yamato a chance to leave and go and hide. And thinking about it, during this time frame, Yamato's been sitting in this cave for 10 days. They haven't had any food beyond like the little bit of provisions that Kaido threw in with them in the beginning. And what probably happened was Yamato ended up going off and like was just so hungry, found his way to wherever the heck it was that Kaido was holding the, Inu Ino no Mi, Okuchi no Makami, that became Yamato's devil fruit, and Yamato found it, not quite knowing what it was, but was hungry enough and ate it. So there's not much else there, but like their actions is probably what leads to that. And ultimately, of course, Ushimaru, along with the other two daimyos, perish while fighting Kaido. And their legacy is Yamato. It's like not related to any of them. Is the son of Kaido, the man who threw them in the cave in the first place and killed their rightful shogun in the form of Odin and everything. Helped propagate Orochi in this country and everything. And their legacy is basically Yamato, is teaching Yamato about, kind of to a degree, right from wrong and what it means to stand up for what you believe in. And they do that. And, all of that, is kind of carried on, and that those lessons are what helped carry Yamato for the next 20 years. And, Yamato, who gets beaten and bruised and broken bones and so many different injuries and everything else, almost dying probably multiple times trying to defeat Kaido over the next 20 years, so many different times, trapped on Onigashima, can't leave, and then eventually, all of it eventually leads up to, the Battle of Onigashima. And Yamato is like their kind of lasting contribution. Yamato is their legacy, which is pretty cool. That leads to, of course, him helping Luffy and all of the others. Although I don't think there's ever going to be a moment where Yamato, like, looks at Zoro and is just like, you look familiar. Can I put you in a blue-haired wig for, like, 5 minutes? Because, of course, Zoro looks a lot like Ushimaru and everything, which, but he has green hair because the green hair probably came from, like, his mother or something. Because her name's Terra, and Terra is Earth, and green, and blah, 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 blah. Take your pick. So there's that. In regards to trivia for Ushimaru, his name comes from, and I'm going to mispronounce this, and I apologize, Ushi Wakamaru, the childhood name for Minatomo, which is, of course, reference to stuff with Minatomo. Different references there. Of course, with the SBS with Zoro's family, we get much more information about, Zoro's family tree and how, Ushimaru fits into it and everything. And of course in the English, Chris Sabat voices both Zoro and Ushimaru. I don't think they did that in the Japanese dub, but they did that in the English dub, in the original Japanese. But they did it in the English dub, which is fine. I'm fine with that. And there is like some symmetry there with like during the fight in the banquet hall when it's Kawamatsu and Hirogoro, I believe, watch Zoro do some of his fighting against, like, King and Queen during that moment there, that they make some comparisons. Zoro, not only to, like, Ryuma, but also to Ushimaru in that sense. And I was like, well, and I just thought, I was like, well, Onimaru does get to meet Zoro. He's the one who steals Shusui in the first place from Zoro. But, like, Onimaru doesn't know about the connection there between Zoro and his master, which is kind of funny. And everything. So it's like, well, we'll see what happens with that. And then just for, like, some... I kind of covered a lot of this already, but just, brief history for the stuff for the Shimotsuki family. There's, of course, Ryuma kind of seems to be possibly, like, the origin point for it. And then eventually, like, that leads into one of his descendants becoming the daimyo of Ringo, and then so on and so forth. And then eventually, so much stuff happens there that I already went into. And then, of course, we have Shimotsuki Kozaburo, as I said, 55 years ago. Him and a bunch of others, including Furiko, all end up leaving, and they make their way to the East Blue, and they, of course, end up, founding Shimotsuki Village and everything. And then, of course, other things happen where then he has Koshiro, and then, of course, that eventually leads to Kuina, and then, of course, that leads to everything else there when Kuina dies from falling down the stairs, however you want to put that. And then, of course, her bond with Zoro. And then, of course, for the Shimotsuki line that leads to Zoro, the main family line that leads to Zoro, of course, Furiko ends up marrying Roronoa Pin Zoro. And then they have their son, Pinzoro Arashi. Or, sorry, not Pinzoro Arashi. Roronoa Arashi. And then Arashi ends up marrying the daughter of a mountain bandit named Terra. And then, of course, they end up having their own son, Zoro. Arashi is, I think, at one point in time killed by pirates, I think. And then, like, Terra at some point succumbs to generic manga/anime mom disease that somehow kills the mother because reasons. It's like, I was trying to think of, like, are there any, like, well, shonen anime specifically. I was like, okay, well, I mean, Zuko's parent, he still has his mom. Bakugo has both of his parents. But then you look at Shoto, who just has such a messed up family, and I'm like, oh, that doesn't quite work. And, Izuku's dad isn't around at all. And I was just like, Bleach doesn't really have that because his mom's dead anyway. And then other reasons. And I'm like, well, and I was like, I don't know. It's like, I can do... Anya has both of her parents, but it's all a big ruse. And I was just like, I don't know. I was trying to think of something else. Both of Asta's parents are dead. Black Clover reference there. And then I've got Sailor Moon over here, who, I mean, like, both of Serena's parents are alive in Sailor Moon. She's got a perfectly well-adjusted family with her parents and her annoying little brother. So it's like, it's not always the case, but it's the case a lot of the And then, of course, Zoro is, of course, kind of the one that's kind of bearing that, legacy now, even though he doesn't know about his connection. He probably doesn't even know about the connection that he would possibly have to Kuina in that regard. And since it's not stated specifically that, like, Kozaburo is, like, specifically, like, this close of a relation to, like, Furiko. Because of, like, if he was another member of the main branch family, that would have probably been listed in it, but we don't know. It just could have been several generations back that they were related and then married off and then different brother or something like that. And then, of course, there's, so much else. There's everything that connects in regards to Yasuie and everything else that happens there with his connections, which I'll go over a lot more. There's everything that I already went over with Thriller Bark, and then, of course, how everything ends in Wano country and everything during the Wano arc, with everything finally ending in the Battle of Onigashima, where it, of course, Zoro uses Enmo, which was, of course, the other sword that was made by Kozaburo and everything, and, has this amazing connection, has these connections to Wano and everything. And, of course, last bit that I haven't mentioned yet, of course, is Shimotsuki. The name literally translates to Frost Moon. And of course, in regards to 4 of the 5 main families in Wano, all of the kanjis for all of their names somehow contain moon, except for Kozuki, except for why do I have such a hard time doing the differentials between Kurozumi and Kozuki? Well, they both start with K. Yeah, I know. I did that a bunch in the Orochi video. Except for Kurozumi, which does not have that. It's like charcoal, black charcoal is like what that name refers to. And then, of course, Shimotsuki is the old Japanese name for November, because November is to a degree when the first frosts tended to happen. And then, of course, both Ryuma and Zoro's birthdays are in November. I'm recording this like the day before Zoro's birthday, before the 11th. I'm recording this on the 10th, and the 11th is Zoro's birthday, so there's that. So, by the time this goes up, it will have been Zoro's birthday, and then I think Ryuma's birthday was like the 6th or something, if I remember correctly, but I don't quote me on that. But that's what I have here for the Shimotsuki family. As I said, I will be doing a more in-depth one about Yasuie. Well, 2 more in-depth ones about Yasuie in regards to his life. Both as Yasuie and then as Tonoyasu. And then I'll do another video where I talk specifically about the other 2 daimyo, or the other daimyo families that we are aware of in Wano. And any other ones I kind of hold that position at the moment. So that's what I have. I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye.